In a moment, their focus shifted to a man sitting alone at an adjacent table. One of them knew exactly who he was. He had relocated to this quiet town about 8 years ago, having retired from a life of illicit dealings, and had been a ghost ever since without friends. He had no family, no real occupation, and one of the men lamented to his friend how this very person had recently refused to help his son. When his boy was cornered by a local crew, the man had simply walked on by, not even thinking to contact the authorities. They both watched as he finally got up from his seat. As he passed their table, he stopped for a split second, having overheard them mention that same crew, but he didn't linger. He pushed open the door and stepped outside. There he was greeted by a waiter he knew well, who seemed surprised by such an early exit, given the man usually stayed until at least 11. The waiter suggested to him, a man named Sean, that he should pay mind to what those men said about him being apathetic to the plights of others. After all, even his own younger brother knew he was a kind and considerate person at heart. Sean looked at him but said nothing in return. He simply offered a quiet goodnight and made for the door, the waiter watching him go. The waiter thought to himself that Sean was a rather handsome man. He would probably make a wonderful match for his son if only he had a stable career and wasn't so intensely private. A short time later, Sean arrived at his home. With a click of the lock, he let himself in and moved toward the table where a coffee cup was waiting, setting down a folder he had with him. He took a sip from the cup, and in that same instant a faint noise made him freeze his eyes, catching a fleeting reflection in the windowpane. He saw a figure approaching. Sean spun around, and standing directly behind him was the very man he had just glimpsed in the glass. He was a dark-haired man with piercing eyes that stared at him without a single blink. Sean remained completely still, trying to decipher who this intruder could possibly be. The man smiled, remarking that Sean's awareness of his surroundings was not quite what it once was. He pointed out that Sean had failed to even notice someone entering his home. If his intention had been to end him, it could have been done with embarrassing ease. Sean's thoughts raced, trying to connect the dots of who this man was and how he'd been located after 10 years of silence. At last, he broke the silence, asking who had sent him. The man replied that no one had. He was acting on his own initiative. He added that while Sean might not recognize him, he should remember saving a child named Alpha on the North Coast. 10 years ago, he said, a child with a special type of blood. Sean continued to stare at the stranger, his expression unreadable. In a blur of motion, Sean grabbed a knife from the kitchen table and swung it. With all his force, the knife slammed into the glass behind the man, shattering it. The blade had missed him by only a few millimeters, leaving a light scratch on his cheek. "Get out!" Sean yelled. The man touched his injured cheek and noted that Sean hadn't completely lost his edge just yet. Then, looking at him with a knowing half-smile, he mentioned how Sean had disappeared at the absolute peak of his career 10 years ago, right after saving him to hide out in this small town. Sean glared at him, warning him to leave before he sent another knife his way, but the man calmly replied that Sean still lacked the will to truly eliminate him, no matter how much he might desire it. Sean's hand tightened around another knife, yet the man stood perfectly calm. His hands were tucked casually in his pockets. All at once, Sean's vision began to blur, the knife slipping from his fingers and clattering to the floor. He felt a wave of dizziness, the room spinning around him. The man started toward him slowly. Sean realized it had to have been something in the coffee he'd just consumed. His balance gave way, but the man caught him before he could fall. "It's sad," the man murmured, "to see an enforcer from one of the city's major factions fall so far. Living in this little town taken down by just one cup of coffee." Sean tried to grab his collar, but the man easily blocked his hand with a smirk. Holding him steady, he said that he had been searching for him for a very long time, looking deep into Sean's eyes. He added that he had spent 10 years on this quest, and now his efforts had finally paid off. A long time ago, a little boy stood looking up at the roof of a high-rise building. He got his father's attention, shouting that there was someone up on the edge. His father looked and said that it was an operative named Jing. The man wore a mask and gloves, and they called him the Thorn. All sorts of criminals, traffickers, and manipulators could be his targets. "He is one of the very best," his father explained. The boy Jason asked if his father had ever enlisted Jing's services. The man confirmed that he was a regular client and that every job Jing undertook he completed without fail. Jason asked if they could hire Jing to protect them. That way he could go with his father. His father sighed, saying they didn't have the money to afford that kind of security right now. At that moment, the boy looked up again. The Thorn didn't seem to notice him at first, but then their eyes met. Jason flinched, and his father told him not to be afraid. After a moment, the assassin was gone from the rooftop. Meanwhile, Jason's father was contacting his partners. He was asking them to take the boy to meet a woman named Christine at the North Shore warehouse in a week's time. If everything went smoothly, they would be reunited later. Before departing, the father told Jason to look after his uncles to remain alert and to defend himself if he ever faced any danger. Then, with a wave goodbye, he left. Jason turned to his uncles and asked if they could ask Jing for help to deal with the bad people who were threatening his father. The uncles told him that Jing was already on another assignment and wouldn't take their case unless they could increase the payment, and even then, it was risky to get involved with someone of his reputation. Jason sighed with disappointment, thinking to himself that Jing must be different from the stories people told. Back in the present at Sean's house, Zusan sat casually on the couch while Sean slept on the bed nearby. Hearing a noise, Zusan looked over and saw that Sean was waking up. Sean opened his eyes and tried to sit up, but Zusan advised him to be careful as the dose he'd been given had been quite powerful. All Sean could manage was a single question. "Why have you been looking for me? What do you want?" Zusan replied that he wanted to know every single thing about him. With his hands in his pockets, he shrugged and said he had no other choice, adding that he had been tormented by unanswered questions for years. Then sitting beside Sean on the bed, Zusan said he might seem ungrateful for what happened in the past, but after 10 long years he was finally near the object of his obsession. He asked Sean if he could possibly understand the feeling of such an unbearable longing, one that was nearly indistinguishable from despair. At that moment, Zusan noticed a familiar scent. It was Sean's pheromones. Sean realized that the fragrance had not been there before he lost consciousness 10 years ago. He had been warned that the child he saved carried a special bloodline from his father's side, one that could influence others through pheromones. Even a beta like Sean, who is typically 70% immune to alpha and omega pheromones, could be affected by someone like Zusan. And now it was happening. The grown-up child he had once rescued was sitting directly in front of him. Zusan leaned closer and asked softly, if Sean could smell his pheromones. Suddenly, Sean shoved him away and glared at him coldly. "There is only Sean Jiang here." "There is no Jing," he stated. Zusan didn't argue. He smiled slightly and agreed to call him Sean. Then Sean warned him, "If you have any special intentions, you had better tell me now, otherwise it might be too late." Zusan looked at him intently. He was realizing that what he truly desired was to possess him. In fact, with this Zusan, it was not the least bit different from the other men who used to be obsessed with him. It seemed those words truly stung the young man. Zusan shook his head and said that not only was he fixated on him, sino que lo había recordado durante los 10 años y ciertamente sería más obediente que otros tipos when bufo enojado y se preguntó por qué. He hadn't listened to him back then when he asked him to leave. He raised his head, and he demanded that the man stop letting his pheromones flow and close his eyes. Zusan hummed, but he complied with the request. He then leaned even closer to Wen and stated that he had plenty of time, and he looked forward to whatever the man planned to do next. Wen gently touched his face. Zusan complied with his request and kept his eyes closed, while Wen pretended to caress him. Wen squinted his eyes with a cold light. A moment later, Wen was already behind the man, his arms wrapping around his neck as he whispered in his ear, asking him if he was afraid he might get his neck snapped. Zusan turned his head toward him, still without opening his eyes, and he calmly said, grabbing Wen's hand and looking up at him from below, that of course he wasn't afraid. Wen was watching him tensely, and Zusan explained that he would simply never be able to bring himself to do it. He basically had no choice but to submit to him. Wen looked at him with bewilderment and surprise. The sight truly amused Zusan, but Wen suddenly moved away from him abruptly again, which didn't seem to please Zusan very much. After that, Wen again asked him to close his eyes and turn toward him, to which Zusan, smiling, agreed. He complied with the request, but couldn't resist a final jab. Wen couldn't escape him anyway, Zusan stated, and the longer he kept him waiting, the harder it would ultimately be for himself. However, by the time he spoke, Wen was already gone. Zusan found himself sitting alone on the bed, and it dawned on him that Wen had cleverly used pheromones to distract him and make his escape. He inhaled the delightful scent and realized he had to be extremely cautious around this guy. Although the truth was, the aroma of Wen the Beta was somewhat perplexing to him. Wen likely held some secrets. Just then, an assistant approached Zusan and informed him that Jing had just made his getaway and they were unable to stop him. Zusan felt more than a bit frustrated by their display of weakness. However, his assistant reminded him that Jing was indeed very formidable and not easy to handle. On top of that, Jing had even coerced the assistant into giving him his pants and shoes, while Zusan had cleverly hidden them. Zoe stood up and made his way to the exit, casually mentioning that all assassins should be put on high alert. They were determined to retrieve their elder safely today. Meanwhile, Sean strolled down the street briskly, occasionally bumping into his neighbours. This didn't surprise him at all, as everyone was familiar with one another in this small town. He paused outside a house, noting that this old villa had recently undergone renovations, but remained vacant. It had been purchased by Zusan in a manner of speaking. As he gazed at the house, he reflected that perhaps the worst part of everything that had transpired was that he had impersonated a beta with special pheromones to escape. He just happened to belong to a rare group of beta males who developed unique pheromones after reaching adulthood. His pheromones were also exceptional, bringing him fortune the first time when he was 14 years old, when he discovered gold thanks to his pheromones, which were akin to a legendary plant known for attracting wealth called meadow horsetail. This phenomenon had allowed him to become an independent assassin a decade ago. Soon Wen arrived home. Once inside, he slammed the door with a loud bang, scanned the room, walked over to the desk and pulled open the drawer, only to be unpleasantly surprised by its emptiness. He moved to another table, shifted a floor tile aside, and rummaged through the opening, cursing profusely as he realized all his ammunition had been confiscated. Wen understood that Zusan, instead of taking him away while he was unconscious, had bought a villa in the neighborhood. The boy wondered what had transpired that caused him to remain. As if recalling something, he hurried up the stairs, carefully opened the door to the rooftop, and was taken aback by the sight before him. Assassins were scattered all over the roof just as he had been before. As he scanned the crowd, he felt a twinge of discomfort at the sheer number of them. At that moment, the killers recognized him. Simultaneously, one of the guys with a knife lunged at him from above, but things didn't go as he had planned. Wen intercepted his attack and brought the guy crashing to the ground, swiftly mounting him for control. Wen pressed a knife to the guy's neck, and the man stammered that he was his favorite killer, which puzzled Wen somewhat. The guy offered to comply with anything Wen desired, but in the next instant, Wen angrily punched him, glaring and demanding to know what he wanted from him. The other guy replied that he should surrender and join them, otherwise those similar to him below might get hurt. When Wen realized he was right, the other individual responded that he ought to surrender and join them, or else those similar below might suffer when they realized he was indeed correct. He would end this guy's life. But the killer merely shrugged, as that guy was precisely the type who wished to die at his hands. Wen raised the knife, feeling his hand tremble. The guy in front of him asked why he didn't just give up, and then he noticed Jing was watching his brother, looking as if he wanted to leap to him, worried that Wen wouldn't be able to handle the situation in his current state. Before he could finish his thought, Wen charged forward, leaping and swinging his hand sharply. He seemed oblivious to everything around him except his target. Suddenly, he felt someone grab him. The guy hurled the knife forward and it clattered to the ground. Wen found Zusan standing before him. The man looked at him reproachfully, scooped him up in an embrace, and declared that he was putting his life in grave danger. Zusan undoubtedly recognized him, then seized him by the shirt and demanded that he not harm anyone in this town. Zusan smirked and replied that it was up to him. He had a choice to make, either him or the city. Wen looked down at the street again, then tightened his grip on Zusan's shirt, fully aware that in his current state the odds were not in his favor. Wen stood silent for a moment, breathing heavily, then pushed Zusan away condescendingly, stating that the guy could do whatever he wanted. The main thing was to ensure no one in town got hurt. Zusan smiled triumphantly and shouted to his aides to vacate the area, urging them to be kind to the townspeople. The deputies complied with his request and began to leave the roof. Wen turned his back to Zusan when the man suddenly grasped his arm, and to show kindness to the residents of this town, the deputies agreed to his request and began to descend from the roof. Wen turned his back to Zusan just as the man unexpectedly seized his arm. Wen opened his eyes, broke the kiss, bit the guy's lip, and then forcefully pushed Zusan away. The guy yelped, noting that he was in considerable pain. Afterward, he looked at Wen and asked how he could have bitten him so hard. Wen replied with silence, placing his hand to his lips and glaring at Jen. Jen grinned and remarked that if he had kissed anyone before, he would hunt them down and eliminate them all. Wen took a deep breath and replied that no matter what Jen wanted from him, he'd better stop, or it would end badly for him. He threatened to kill him. Jen was genuinely offended by this, as he had dedicated over 10 years to his work. Why should he now abandon the fruits of so many years? Wen stared at him unblinkingly, and Jen suddenly moved closer to Wen again, stating that he had endured all sorts of inconveniences for the past 10 years, but he still found him, and for that he deserved commendation, not discouragement. Jen cautiously approached. He had endured all sorts of hardships for these 10 years. Yet he still managed to find him, and for that he deserved praise, not discouragement. Zen approached with caution. As he got closer to the man, he placed his hands against the wall, pinning him down. Zusan clarified to the boy that he wasn't going to stop there. His desire to find him extended far beyond just searching for him. He yearned to forge a deeper connection, one where they couldn't imagine life without each other. Wen gazed at the man in silence as if processing what he had just heard. He had anticipated this reaction. Then he touched Wen and promised to begin pursuing him through physical affection. Wen seized Zosan's arm to prevent him from touching him. Zosan looked at the boy puzzled and grinned, noting that Wen seemed to have forgotten their recent conversation. With a smug expression, Zosan gazed at the astonished Wen and explained that he had a lot of dirt on him. Wen loosened his grip and released Zosan's hand. The boy extended his palm again and ran it along the back of Wen's neck, leaning in closer and closer. Wen quickly lifted his head and suggested they leave the roof, proposing they go inside the house instead. Zosan didn't pause to ask what he was afraid of, and abruptly changed the topic, inquiring where Wen's tonsils were. He explained that if a beta had flavored tonsils, and abruptly shifted the topic, inquiring where Wen's tonsils were. He explained that if a beta had flavored tonsils, it was rare for them to be concentrated in any one area of the body, like the mouth or chest. He suppressed betas rather than killed them, and he had never marked anyone before because he only wanted Wen. He leaned closer and whispered sweetly, asking whether Wen wasn't at least curious, since it might even trigger his heat cycles. Wen rolled his eyes in surprise and wanted to retreat, but there was still a wall behind him. He snapped at Zosan to do whatever he wanted with him, just to leave his flavored tonsils alone. But Zosan didn't seem to be listening. His attention was fixated on Wen's neck. He smiled. Having found what he was searching for, it was on the right side of Wen's neck. Wen disliked that Zosan had figured it out so easily, especially since it had always been his secret weapon. Zosan noticed Wen's unease and condescendingly promised to leave his tonsils alone, but hoped he could still continue to touch him. Wen shrugged and didn't protest. Zosan explained that he didn't wish to force him into anything. However, the last time they spoke, Wen had just run away. Zosan leaned even closer and declared that this time he wouldn't heed him. However, the last time they conversed, Wen had just fled. Susan leaned in even closer and stated that this time he wouldn't heed his words. Nothing happened. The only thing he achieved was draining Wen of his strength. Finally, Zosan gave up and pulled away. Wen stood with his eyes closed, then collapsed right into Zosan's arms. Zosan lifted the boy, wondering why he couldn't mark him, why he was merely sapping his strength. He carried Wen into the house, laid him on the bed, and called one of his assistants. Zosan asked what could be happening with Jing, since the assistant knew more about pheromones. The assistant replied that most betas do not possess pheromones. Zusan questioned what might be happening with Jing, since the assistant had more knowledge about pheromones. The assistant responded that most betas do not possess pheromones, or even scent glands, rendering them impossible to mark. Jing, however, was a unique exception, possessing both pheromones and scent glands. This endowed him with the power to repel any external attempt to mark or injure him. Nevertheless, the assistant continued. While a beta's pheromones lack the potency of an alpha's zine, could still leverage his unique blood to overpower and sway all secondary genders. Consequently, he could theoretically overwhelm Wen's pheromones by infusing the man with his own. Zusan understood this meant he would have to forcibly inject his pheromones, even to the point of physically damaging the beta's body. He resolved to be patient, waiting until he had utterly shattered Wen's resolve. By saturating Wen's glands with his own pheromones until he had fully subjugated his beta, marking his entire being. The aides stood by in silence, until one of them audaciously blurted out that if the boss intended to claim Jing, would he also get an opportunity? The lead assistant hastily silenced the man, then nervously asked if Zusan was truly committed to this path, as Jing would surely end up despising him or worse, trying to kill him. Jen retorted that Jing was incapable of killing him. What he truly dreaded was Jing abandoning him. As night descended outside the window, Wen finally stirred, pushing himself up from the pillow. He gazed around in bewildered surprise, realizing he was back inside Zosan's room. Recalling Zosan's aggressive attempt on him, he was stunned to realize he had fainted. It must have been some kind of instinctual defensive reaction from his body. His only hope now was that his own pheromones could withstand the onslaught. With that thought, Wen rose and departed from the room. Outside, he immediately came face to face with one of Jen's aides, a scarred man who was clearly a key figure in the organization and Zosan's right hand. Wen knew this man would not be an easy opponent to overcome. The aide began to explain that he was there to discuss Wen's recent bodily reaction. But Wen cut him off, stating he had no need for such information. The only thing he demanded to know was the name of the organization the man served. The assistant, whose name was G, merely smirked before raising his arm and rolling up his sleeve, revealing a tattoo representing his organization, which Wen recognized instantly. It was the mark of a group infamous for eliminating traitors from rival syndicates, a group deeply involved in the grim business of illegal organ trafficking. The leader of that very organization was none other than the person Wen himself had once rescued. He never could have imagined that the leader of Barnett's organization would be Zusan, the very same child he had saved 10 years prior. Now grown into a man of brutal violence, Zine observed Wen intently, while Wen could only stare back wide-eyed. Zusan suddenly broke into a bright smile and said cheerfully that he was delighted to have him as part of his organization. Wen was utterly speechless and could only approach Zusan slowly. Zusan in turn watched him with a detached curiosity. Wen considered that he might still be able to turn this situation to his advantage by using Barnett's organization. Still, he had to concede he never anticipated Zusan would be leading such a treacherous group. He paced the room, the realization dawning that the situation was rapidly spiraling beyond his control. Suddenly a hand gripped his elbow, and Wen whirled around only to find himself forcefully pinned against the wall by Zusan. Wen demanded to be released, but Zusan didn't budge. He simply inquired why Wen held such a deep-seated dislike for the organization, when they were for all intents and purposes doing the same thing. Wen objected, insisting that was a lie, and demanded to know how Zusan had become involved with them. Zusan explained it had been his own choice. How else could he have hunted down his father's murderers that he revealed was his final objective? His purpose was to eliminate all the instigators, namely the founder of the entire operation, Cliff Quentin. Wen recognized the name instantly and warned Zusan that Cliff was exceptionally dangerous and not someone to be crossed. Zusan deduced that if Wen knew of the leader's history, they were likely tracking him as well. Wen, however, clarified that his own goals were different. He only sought to eliminate those he had been unable to deal with previously. Zusan snorted dismissively, mocking Wen for having lost his edge so much so that even he could now find and manipulate him. How could Wen possibly hope to stand against someone as powerful as Cliff? Once he committed to revenge, no one could deter him. Wen bristled at the accusation that he had lost his form. Though he had to admit it was true. Ever since saving that child 10 years ago, the trauma had left its mark, and his acuity was no longer what it had been. They stared at each other in silence for a long moment. Finally, Zusan draped an arm around Wen and asked why he refused to admit he was worried about him. Wen snapped back that he wasn't worried in the least. Zusan clearly didn't believe him. Wen seized upon his momentary distraction, shoving him away forcefully. Zine stumbled back, warning him not to meddle in his affairs. If he truly didn't care about his fate, then so be it. He turned to depart, telling Wen he was free to explore the estate as he pleased. But when Wen turned back, the spot where Zusan had been standing was empty. Elsewhere, Zusan just shook his head. Moments later, an aide rushed in, shouting that Wen had escaped through a first-floor window. When asked for orders, Zusan calmly replied that in his current state, Wen wouldn't get far. He was certain Wen wouldn't bring harm to the local townspeople. But now that Wen had discovered the organization he belonged to, the rules of the game had shifted. Zusan would have to alter his own life accordingly, especially since the times themselves had changed. And now more people wanted him dead than had ever wanted Jing dead. Still, he was confident Wen would not truly abandon him. After all, why would he have saved him 10 years ago, if not for that reason? Even if Wen ran, Zusan knew he would eventually find him again. After some time passed, Zusan checked if his assistant had located Wen, but the search proved futile. The beta was nowhere to be found on the estate. Meanwhile, Wen had silently landed atop the main building's roof. He was exhausted. His form truly wasn't what it once was. His primary struggle was the gnawing uncertainty. Despite everything, he felt a strange pity for Zusan, whose own glands were now at risk. And yet a part of him doubted Zusan could handle everything by himself. He tried to force those troubling thoughts from his mind, but they continued to keep him on edge. Wen gazed at Zine's house, then resolutely headed back inside. He made his way directly to Zine's bedroom. The roof had been completely unguarded, and he noted the house's windows were all wide open. This discovery was somewhat discouraging. He couldn't comprehend how, with such a careless approach to security, Zine had survived this long as the organization's leader. He was acting with extreme irresponsibility. Zusan was sound asleep, not even stirring, as Wen approached the bed. Wen froze at the bedside and simply stared. Zusan looked so defenseless, almost childlike. Wen reached out, intending to run a hand through his hair, But he stopped midway, startled by the direction of his own thoughts. He realized Zine was no longer the child he had known 10 years ago, the same boy who had once sought him out for comfort and protection. Wen tried to push the memories aside. He turned to leave, already regretting his return, but then Zine's hand shot out, catching his and pulling him down onto the bed. The next moment, Wen found himself pinned to the mattress with Zine rising above him. "So you're not going anywhere?" Zine asked softly. Wen snorted. "How could I with my stamina this depleted?" he retorted, trying to wrench his arm free. "Don't grip me so hard." Zusan relaxed his hold and explained quietly, "I'm just afraid of losing you. I've already lost everything once, and you are the only person who has ever shown me any care." Even though Jing had sensed the boy's deep dependence on him back then, he had still made the choice to leave. Young Zusan had hated him for what he saw as his heartlessness, for not even taking his hand when he needed it most. He had been utterly helpless before Wen, and now all these years later, Wen still found he couldn't completely sever ties. Deep down, he carried the guilt of failing to save Zusan's father and still feared for the young man's safety, even now. Wen exhaled slowly. "All of that is long in the past," he said flatly, "and just because you happen to be the only one I ever saved does not mean I'm obligated to take responsibility for you. Whatever path you choose has nothing to do with me." Zusan stared at him, his gaze intense and unblinking for several moments. Then he exhaled sharply, clearly unconvinced by Wen's words. Leaning in even closer, he whispered, "Now I want to mark you more than ever." Wen tried to object, but Zusan suddenly pressed his teeth into his neck. Wen struggled against him, pleading for him to stop, but his efforts were futile. Finally, Zine released him, leaving a distinct bite mark imprinted on his skin. "I'm not surprised," Zine admitted. "You already abandoned me once without regret, so this time I will act with force. You will have to contend with me now. You won't be able to ignore me or cast me aside. Once I mark my beta nothing, and no one will ever be able to separate us." With those words, the alpha sank his teeth into his beta's neck a second time, but after a moment, it still had no effect. The failure took him by surprise. But he wasn't concerned. There was no need to rush. Zine had no intention of letting Wen leave, and he had all the time in the world. Years earlier, the Tarantula organization endured one of the most devastating attacks in its history as gunfire and explosions ripped through their ranks. The confused members hid desperately, trying to recall who they had crossed to deserve this. Perhaps they had taken the parents of the very person now hunting them. But before they could finish that thought, their pursuer appeared. He raised his weapon and fired several shots. It was Jing standing in the pouring rain. He sank to the ground, utterly spent. He lifted his eyes to the clouded sky above. At last he had avenged his parents' killers. Now there was nothing left for him on this earth. He was ready to join them. He closed his eyes and began to weep. But then, through the haze of his fading consciousness, a voice called out his name. Jing struggled to open his eyes, but his eyelids stubbornly sealed shut. When he next awoke, he found himself in a strange room, with the very man who had rescued him sitting at his side. The man introduced himself as Zhu, a businessman. Jing's voice was a mere whisper. "Why did you save me? I've already given up on living." Zhu gave him a peculiar look. "Because for someone your age, you're an exceptionally talented assassin," he stated, "and I have a proposition for you. I will provide you with all the resources you require," he promised, gently patting the boy's head. "Keep living. Find a new reason to exist." Sometime later on the north coast, their paths crossed again under the most tragic of circumstances. Zhu was grievously injured, his hands clutching desperately at Jing's. He was fading, but with his final breath, he pleaded with Jing to protect his son Zusan. These memories swirled through Wen's mind like a vivid, chaotic kaleidoscope. He glanced down at Zusan, who was sprawled atop him, dead to the world in a deep sleep. Wen cautiously wriggled free and managed to slide out of the bed. His left arm was completely numb, and his glands throbbed from the strain of fighting off the alpha's potent pheromones. He knew he had to hold out until his strength came back. And once it did, he would make his move. He was so lost in thought he failed to notice the other presence in the room until his eyes drifted toward the door. A flicker of displeasure crossed his face upon realizing he wasn't alone. It was the deputy's younger brother. Wen commanded the boy to approach. Though the young man had an odd demeanor, he listened intently, and Wen saw a flicker of opportunity, a pawn he could potentially use to his advantage. Jing requested the boy bring him a change of clothes, finding Zusan's wardrobe distasteful. A short while later, Zusan received an update concerning Cliff Quentin. Quentin had recently been spotted on one of the old city streets, though his organizational allegiance remained a mystery. Wen suddenly interjected. He explained that the organization was known as the Black Mamba. Zusan shot him a surprised look as Wen continued, "The church on Klimp Street was one of the Black Mamba's most clandestine bases. 10 years ago, I dismantled all their other locations but that one. Then I retired. Zusan was visibly stunned by his depth of knowledge. At the same time, he decided to inquire about Wen's clothing preferences. The junior assistant eagerly chimed in, explaining that the clothes were his. His older brother immediately tried to silence him, apologizing to the boss. They had borrowed the clothes, he explained, because Wen was too slender for the larger sizes. Wen was taken aback, surprised he was expected to work at all, but Zusan just hummed thoughtfully. "We already discussed this yesterday." Zusan said, striding towards him, "I want us to be partners in the organization." He came to a halt directly in front of Wen to elaborate. "My father always advised me to recruit you as an assassin, and I intend to take his advice." Jing's expression remained neutral as Zusan offered him a handgun. "We share a common objective," he said. "We both want to hunt down and eliminate every founder of Kala." The deputies watched with bated breath as Wen took the weapon. He decided to accept the proposition. This was his chance to finally finish the mission he had been forced to abandon all those years ago. Capturing and dismantling Kala's network had become his sole purpose in life. Then, in a sudden move, Jing aimed the gun directly at Zusan. The deputies drew their own weapons in a flash. But Jing didn't even flinch. He stood perfectly calm, the muzzle pointed squarely at Zusan's chest. Zusan, equally unshaken, ordered his aides to leave the room. Once they were alone, Zusan said in a level voice, "I'm listening." Jing closed the distance between them slowly until the cold barrel of the gun pressed into Zusan's stomach. Zusan gently covered Jing's hand with his own and smiled. "I'm always prepared to listen, especially if it's the start of a negotiation." Jing let out a dry chuckle. "You will accept all of my conditions regarding the Kala group," he stated. Zusan simply nodded. "Fine. And the second condition, do not touch my scent glands," Wen said, his voice sharp. That particular term clearly displeased Zusan. He went completely still, the gun still held firmly between them. Then, as if coming to a decision, he leaned in closer and conceded to that as well. In one fluid motion, he disarmed Jing, knocking the gun from his hand. "But I have a condition of my own," he murmured. "You will not try to run, nor will you resist when I decide to kiss you or hold you." Jing opened his mouth to protest, but Zusan seized his shirt, yanking him closer. Yet Jing halted his resistance, realizing the alpha might respond better to a calm request than to a show of defiance. Otherwise, Zusan might break his own promise, earning nothing but more of Wen's hatred. Jing exhaled softly. "Let me go," he said. Zusan did not insist. He actually let him go, only to pull him back in an instant and press their lips together. Jing offered no resistance, even as their tongues met the beta, quietly succumbing to the kiss. Zusan gazed at him, releasing a wave of his pheromones. Jing instantly understood his intent and, with a surge of effort, shoved the alpha away, genuinely resentful of the chemical manipulation. The alpha merely smiled, pointing out that while Jing had forbidden him from touching his glands, releasing pheromones was an entirely different matter. The beta retreated from the alpha, realizing Zusan could influence him just as much through his breath as contact with his neck. Zusan leaned toward him, smiling, and laughed that he could hold his breath while kissing, but who knew how long he could possibly last? A wave of despair washed over Jing. He had made a tactical error. Just then, the door to the room flew open with a loud bang. Panting assistants burst inside, shouting in a way that startled both Zusan and Jing. They yelled that they had urgent news. Seizing the opportunity, Jing took advantage of the distraction and landed a solid punch on Zusan, sending him stumbling forward. The aides, frozen in shock, immediately drew their weapons and demanded that Jing cease his aggression. Zusan stared back at him, a mixture of surprise and anger in his eyes. He realized that Jing had managed to regain some of his stamina. He ordered his deputies to stand down and finally deliver their news. They obeyed, reporting that members of the Black Mamba organization had been positively identified on Verena Island. Their intelligence suggested the warden was conducting clandestine dealings with the Black Mamba. Jing knew then that the Black Mamba had finally made its move. It was just as he had anticipated. If they wanted to apprehend Cliff Quentin, they would inevitably have to confront their old rivals once more. That family's organization had built its fortune on gold mining, adopting the Black Mamba as its symbol upon their return to power. They had since grown into one of the largest underground syndicates. Zusan only grinned. He was well aware they were the very ones who'd helped Quentin escape before. But now they were brazenly encroaching on his territory, clearly testing his mettle. Zusan ordered his men to prepare for a trip to Verena Island. He planned to depart in a couple of days and intended to go personally. Jing immediately tried to dissuade him, the beta, explaining it was likely a trap designed to lure him out. As the head of Brunet, his appearance was a closely guarded secret. Most assumed he was some old man. It would be far wiser for Zusan to maintain his anonymity. Jing rushed the words out in a single breath, looking earnestly at Zusan. The alpha simply replied that Jing shouldn't mistake him for a child. He had no intention of hiding his identity and had never been afraid of anyone. Jing shook his head, calling the plan reckless and reminding Zusan of his promise to follow his suggestions for the good of the organization. Zusan smiled, saying he was willing to accept Jing's advice, but only within the framework of the plan he himself had already chosen. Jing gave him a look of clear disapproval. The alpha reminded him that his plans and indeed his personal safety were none of Jing's concern, especially since Jing himself had said as much the previous night. Jing had no choice but to concede to Zusan's logic, yet he still voiced his concern that the plan might fail. Then he fell abruptly silent, realizing he had overstepped. He glanced at Zusan nervously, fearing he had angered the alpha, and took a small step back. Just then, an assistant stepped forward to ask what Jing's official position was now. Perhaps the boss intended to make him his right-hand man. The man needed to know if Jing should be included in their strategy meetings. Zusan gave a firm nod and then departed, instructing his assistants to keep a close watch on Jing. Jing watched him leave, thinking that Zusan was at least for now being more restrained, just as he'd promised. The aides then escorted him to the strategy room. There, the chief assistant reintroduced himself and began to bring Jing up to speed, detailing the organizational hierarchy and some of its more confidential operations. Jing listened with rapt attention. Their current objective was to handle the Black Mamba situation. Jing immediately questioned the reliability of their intelligence. Regarding their presence on Verena Island, the assistant Renu replied that the information was not yet fully corroborated, and proving the warden's treachery would be a challenge. This only seemed to anger Jing, who retorted that they could use the interference as a pretext to expose the traitor. Renu agreed, explaining that for the time being, they would operate under the pretense that the information had come to them for verification. Jing suggested there was a way to check whether the Verena Island branch had traded with the Black Mamba before, by searching for gold bars engraved with the Black Mamba's distinct insignia. Renu countered that the island was immense, and locating such bullion would be next to impossible. Jing was mulling this over when the door opened and Zusan stepped inside. While Jing remained lost in thought, Zusan quietly signaled to the deputies. They slipped out of the room without a sound. Zusan approached Jing from behind and suddenly wrapped his arms around him. Jing twitched in surprise, his knife flashing out in a defensive arc. He stopped the motion just as the blade grazed Zusan's throat. He caught the scent of alcohol and asked if Zusan had been drinking. Zusan admitted he had, but only a little. Jing chided him, saying he was the only one taking the strategy sessions seriously. Zusan replied that Jing's perception was simply too weak. After all, he pointed out, you didn't even sense my approach. That could be dangerous. Jing tensed at his words, especially when Zusan added softly, I wouldn't want anyone else to be the one to hurt you. As Zusan pressed a kiss to his neck, Jing forced himself to remain still, his mind screaming that this man was now more dangerous than all the alphas in the world combined. Jing gasped as Zusan unleashed his pheromones, once more yanking his head around for a forceful kiss that flooded his senses, a potent dose delivered with every breath. Overwhelmed by the intoxicating scent, Jing begged him to stop, and when Zusan finally released him, he crumpled forward, his face hitting the table. Zusan, consumed by his own intoxicating aroma, felt an overpowering urge to claim him. But just as he moved, Jing suddenly snapped his head back with violent force. He drove a fist into Zusan's jaw and scrambled to his feet, and at the sound of the commotion, assistants burst into the room only to freeze in stunned disbelief. The assistants could only stare, utterly bewildered by the chaotic sight that greeted them as they rushed through the door. As dusk settled, the bar's lights cast a warm, inviting glow, a familiar beacon in the evening chill. Inside, the air hummed with the lively chatter of patrons, and at one table 2 men sat drinking just like everyone else.